The first thing the Persian scouts noticed in 480 BCE wasn't how many Spartans stood in their way, it was how quiet everything was. At Thermopylae, that thin, brutal corridor carved between mountain and sea, the ground didn't seem to shudder because Persia's host was vast. It seemed to shudder because 300 men refused to yield a single step. Not statues, not legends, not movie silhouettes. Real men planted shoulder to shoulder in the choke point, turning stillness into a weapon. They filled the narrow throat of Thermopylae like a locked gate, bodies darkened by years under the Mediterranean sun. Muscle pulled tight beneath bronze, like cord about to snap. These weren't decorative warriors polished for the ceremony. These were men shaped by deprivation, cold, hunger, pain, and a discipline so absolute it erased hesitation. Their skin carried the mark of a life lived in heat and exertion, sun-browned and hardened over generations. In this telling, their blackness is not presented as costume or symbol, but as consequence. At the center stood King Leonidas I of Sparta, born around 540 BCE, son of King Anaxandridas II. But he was not raised in softness. He was formed inside a system designed to burn weakness out of a child before manhood could even arrive. Long before he walked into the past, Leonidas was already a man marked for death because Sparta's way of producing soldiers did not promise survival. It promised endurance. He had survived the agoge, the state machine that seized boys at 7, shaved their heads, stripped them down, starved them, beat them, and trained them to steal food, only to punish them if they were caught. Not punished for stealing, but for failing. Plutarch, writing centuries later in the 1st century CE, did not describe this as gentle preparation. He described deliberate hardship, suffering engineered to manufacture men who could endure what others could not. Spartan boys slept on reeds cut from riverbanks. They went barefoot year-round. They learned that silence was strength and pain was a language not worth speaking. By the time they reached adulthood, their bodies were pared down into lean slabs of muscle and their minds were disciplined into reflex. Fear was not negotiated with. It was burned out through repetition. This system, the script argues, did not create pale men. It created men adapted to sun, scarcity, and constant physical strain, conditions that darkened skin across generations. And in 480 BCE, Leonidas stood before the greatest empire on earth, Achaemenid Persia, ruled by Xerxes I, and did something empires struggle to understand. He refused to move. He held the pass, and he died there with 300 Spartans, not fighting for conquest, but for honor, law, and ancestral obligation. Yet nearly everything modern audiences believe they know about these men, their appearance, their origins, the world that shaped them, has been altered. Not by accident, but through deliberate reshaping. This video's promise is direct. It claims it will unfold a history pushed out of modern books, revealing who the Spartans truly were and what they looked like, while exposing what it presents as Western distortion aimed at erasing the legacy of a people the modern world is not meant to recognize. Before the story continues, the script pauses to ask for support. A thumbs up, a share with friends and family, and a subscription to stay connected for more eye-opening Black history. Then it returns to its central claim with a hard pivot. Sparta, it says, was not a white world. Sparta is not the pale, marble-skinned fantasy frozen into modern textbooks and reinforced on Hollywood screens. The only Sparta this narration recognizes is a Sparta of sun-darkened warriors, men hardened across generations by labor, discipline, and war. Their skin shines dark beneath the Greek sun. Their backs are carved by training so ruthless it crushes fear itself. When they advance, the earth seems to retreat, and this, the narrator insists, is where the true story begins, at the exact point later storytelling tries to erase. In 480 BCE at Thermopylae, the Spartans you were never shown, the script claims, faced the largest invading force the ancient world had ever known. Xerxes I commanded an army that Herodotus famously described as over 1 million. Modern scholars reduced that number, but the point remains. The invading force was overwhelming. And the Spartans were not alone. They were accompanied by helots, state-owned men forced into service. They trained, fought, bled, and died beside Spartan citizens, yet were denied honor, denied citizenship, denied remembrance. The script describes these helots, many drawn from Messenia, as numerous, physically powerful, and dark-skinned in ancient accounts. Aristotle is invoked to underline the fear simmering beneath Spartan society. The helots, he warned, were always waiting for disaster, always close to rebellion. This leads to the next crucial framing. The ancient Mediterranean world, the script argues, was not racially white in the modern sense. It was a crossroads where Africa, Asia, and Europe met through movement, trade, and war. Ancient Greeks described human difference, it says, not through modern racial categories, but through climate, sun exposure, and geography. That doesn't mean people in antiquity were colorless or blind to appearance. Ancient writers described skin, hair, and physical difference repeatedly, simply through a different lens than later European racial thinking. Herodotus is then brought forward as a key witness. In his histories, the script notes he described Egyptians and Colchians as black-skinned and woolly-haired, and made a claim that the Colchians were of Egyptian stock. And the narrator's question is immediate. Why does that matter? Because, it argues, Sparta traced important connections eastward and southward, not northward into Europe, setting the stage for the script's broader claim about who the Spartans were and how later eras recast them. According to the narrative being laid out, Sparta's roots do not point toward northern Europe. They point south and east into regions historically intertwined with Africa and the Near East. The Dorian Greeks, identified as Sparta's founders, migrated through territories already shaped by Afroasiatic cultures around 1100 BCE. These migrations did not occur in isolation. They moved through Anatolia, the Levant, and zones of sustained contact with North Africa. This matters because it challenges the later image of Sparta as a racially sealed, proto-European society. Ancient visual evidence is presented as part of this challenge. Early vase paintings, frescoes, and sculptures consistently show Spartan warriors with darker complexions, tightly curled hair, and broad facial features. These images, the script argues, were later altered through Roman copying and Renaissance reinterpretation. Original pigments, reds, browns, and blacks, were scraped away, leaving behind bare marble that later generations mistook for intentional whiteness rather than the residue of time and ideology. Sparta's rise followed the collapse of Mycenaean Greece after the Dorian invasions. These upheavals reshaped the Greek world around 1100 BCE. The Dorians, the script insists, did not arrive as pale northern Europeans. They came as sun-adapted, war-trained migrants from the southern Aegean world, already connected to Africa and the Near East through trade, warfare, and shared ancestry. One of the most provocative pieces of evidence introduced is drawn from a later source, a diplomatic letter recorded in the biblical book of 1 Maccabees, chapter 12, verses 20 to 23. In this letter, King Arius of Sparta writes to Onias, the high priest of Israel, stating that documents had been found indicating that Spartans and Jews were related and descended from Abraham. The letter proposes mutual aid and shared resources, framing the relationship not as metaphor but as kinship. The script emphasizes that this was not poetic language or symbolic diplomacy. It presents the exchange as a serious political assertion made around 170 to 160 BCE, attributed to King Arius I of Sparta, who ruled between 309 and 265 BCE. The Israelites, described in biblical Egyptian and Assyrian records as dark-skinned Afroasiatic people, were not claiming a fictional bond. They were acknowledging what the letter presents as shared ancestry. Modern scholars, the narrator claims, have struggled to dismiss this correspondence without undermining broader classical credibility. Frank M. Snowden Jr., a respected historian of antiquity, is cited as having demonstrated extensively that Africans were visible, integrated participants throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. The Maccabees letter, the script argues, quietly destabilizes the racial myth of ancient Sparta by pointing toward an Afroasiatic lineage tied to Abraham, a Near Eastern figure with deep cultural and geographic links to Africa. This claimed connection aligns with growing scholarly discussions about the ethnic diversity of ancient Mediterranean civilizations. If Spartan elites traced lineage into Abrahamic tradition, then depictions of figures like Leonidas as purely white Europeans become increasingly difficult to defend. The script frames this not as speculation, but as a convergence of textual, geographic, and cultural evidence pointing toward African and Semitic roots long minimized in Western narratives. Geography reinforces the argument. Sparta sat in the southern Peloponnese, in a Mediterranean climate defined by heat, sun, and agricultural labor. This was not a land that produced fair-skinned, blonde populations in isolation. It was a region shaped by olive cultivation, trade routes, and constant exchange with Egypt, Phoenicia, Persia, and beyond. Sparta's alternative name, Lacedaemon, situates it firmly within this interconnected southern world. The script then broadens into a structural overview of Spartan society. By 800 BCE, Sparta had become a fully militarized state organized around three classes. First were the Spartiates, full citizens and professional warriors by law. Second were the Perioikoi, free non-citizens who worked as artisans and traders. Third were the helots, an enslaved population that formed the economic backbone of Spartan life and were described as militarily indispensable. Every healthy male Spartan citizen was required to pass through the agoge, the state-controlled system emphasizing obedience, endurance, courage, and absolute loyalty to the state. Men lived communally well into adulthood. Personal ambition was subordinated entirely to collective military readiness. Loyalty to Sparta came before family, comfort, or individual desire. The helots, whose name translates to captives, were largely drawn from conquered populations in Laconia and Messenia. They worked the land, maintained households, raised children, and accompanied Spartan armies as attendants and fighters. The script stresses that Spartan society could not function without them, and yet they were denied rights, recognition, and memory. Ancient sources reveal that fear of helot rebellion dominated Spartan policy. Aristotle is cited again, noting that helots were treated with exceptional cruelty because they were numerous, strong, and ever-present. According to the script, contempt alone cannot explain the systematic violence directed at them. What explains it is terror. Every year, the ephors, Sparta's magistrates, formally declared war on the helots. This ritualized declaration allowed Spartans to kill helots without religious consequence. The task was often assigned to the Crypteia, a secret police force composed of young Spartan men who roamed the countryside at night, assassinating strong or outspoken helots. Plutarch later described this practice plainly. They killed any helot they encountered. The script frames this not as discipline, but as organized terror centuries before modern racial language existed. It was a system built on fear of a physically dominant, darker population realizing its collective power. This dynamic, the narration argues, is critical to understanding Sparta. A society does not invent such mechanisms unless it fears the people it oppresses. And this fear sets the stage for how later generations would reshape Spartan history, smoothing over its contradictions, erasing its darker majority, and recasting its warriors into a form that better served European identity centuries later. This fear shaped every layer of Spartan life. The helots were not a small underclass. They were the majority. According to Herodotus, at the time of the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE, there were roughly 7 helots for every Spartan citizen soldier. That imbalance haunted the Spartan state. Control was not a preference. It was an obsession. Uprisings were not hypothetical. They occurred repeatedly. One of the most notable was the conspiracy of Snowden in 399 BCE. Snowden was a trusted member of the king's bodyguard, though not a full citizen. His plan was to overthrow the Spartan elite and redistribute power among a broader population of Lacedaemonians. The plot was carefully organized, but eventually betrayed. Spartan authorities crushed the conspiracy without hesitation. Snowden was arrested and likely executed. The response was not reform, it was repression. Thucydides, writing in the late 5th century BCE, described Sparta as living in constant fear of helot rebellion. Aristotle confirmed this anxiety, noting that helots were treated with exceptional cruelty precisely because of their strength and numbers. These were not weak peasants. They were agricultural laborers hardened by the sun, porters, builders, and crucially, military auxiliaries. Plutarch records that helots fought beside Spartan citizens in war, carried their shields, and in some cases bore arms. Yet they were denied honor, denied public memory, and denied historical presence. Their role was essential, but their existence was treated as a threat. To manage this threat, Sparta institutionalized terror. The Crypteia became a mechanism of population control. Young Spartan men fresh from the agoge were sent into the countryside at night with knives. Their task was simple: Eliminate helots who appeared strong, intelligent, or influential. This was not law enforcement. It was psychological warfare. The goal was not only to thin numbers, but to break spirit. No society invents such a system unless it fears the people beneath it. And this fear exposes the contradiction at the heart of Sparta. The citizen warriors celebrated for discipline and unity depended entirely on a darker, larger population they could never fully control. This context matters when discussing the physical reality of Spartan society. The script argues that it is historically incoherent to imagine Sparta as uniformly white, while it rested on the forced labor of a sun-darkened majority. The Spartan citizen class itself emerged from the same environment, shaped by the same climate, diet, and centuries of interaction. Skin does not remain pale under such conditions. Not biologically, not historically. Frank M. Snowden Jr., in his foundational work Blacks in Antiquity, published in 1970, argued that classical writers were not confused about African presence. They were comfortable with it. Greeks and Romans described blackness without the pathological racial anxiety that emerged much later. That anxiety, Snowden demonstrated, was a product of modern Europe, not antiquity. The discomfort intensified during the 18th and 19th centuries when Europe was deeply entangled in slavery, colonial expansion, and racial hierarchy. At that moment, a problem emerged. How do you justify white supremacy when the ancient world, the source of Western legitimacy, was visibly darker? The solution was rewriting. Greek statues were stripped of color and presented as pristine white marble. African and Afroasiatic features were softened or resculpted. Helots were removed from military narratives. Sparta was reframed as a proto-European ideal rather than a product of the ancient Mediterranean world. Johann Joachim Winckelmann, often called the father of modern art history, played a central role in this transformation. Despite overwhelming archaeological evidence of polychromy, he promoted Greek whiteness as an aesthetic and moral ideal. Marble became philosophy. Absence of color became purity. And black Spartans were buried beneath plaster, scholarship, and silence, yet fragments survived. Ancient DNA studies show that southern Greek populations carried Mediterranean and North African genetic markers. Classical texts repeatedly describe dark skin as normal. African warriors appear throughout Greek military history, from Egypt and Nubia to Caucasus. Sparta was not an anomaly. It was part of a broader Afro-Mediterranean world that later Europe found threatening. Ancient writers never described Spartans as fair or flaxen-haired. They described them as severe, hardened, and terrifying. Xenophon, writing in the early 4th century BCE, marveled at their conditioning and collective discipline, noting that Spartan bodies looked forged rather than grown. Aristotle described a society under permanent tension, built so completely for war that even peace felt like preparation for bloodshed. Spartan women, though excluded from direct combat, occupied a distinct position. They were educated, outspoken, and granted more autonomy than women in many other Greek city-states. They trained athletically, competed publicly, and were expected to produce strong offspring for the state. Domestic labor was largely handled by helots, freeing Spartan women from many household constraints. Marriage was regulated by state interest. Women shaved their heads before marriage and kept their hair short afterward. Men under 30 continued to live in communal barracks, visiting their wives in secret at night. The goal was not romance. It was reproduction in service of military continuity. Sparta did not exist in isolation. From its rise after the Dorian migrations, it operated within a Mediterranean world bound together by trade, warfare, and movement. Herodotus never imagined Greece as racially sealed. He openly traced Greek religious traditions and heroic lineages into Egypt and Libya. Heracles, from whom Spartan kings claimed descent, was repeatedly said to have traveled to Africa, learned from African priests, and drawn strength from lands south of the Aegean. This lineage mattered. Spartan kings were Heraclids not merely by myth, but by political theology. Their authority pointed south and east, not north into Europe. Greek art before Roman copying reflected this reality. Early vase paintings from the 6th and 5th centuries BCE depict warriors in deep reddish brown and black tones, with thick limbs, broad noses, and tightly curled hair. Modern pigment analysis has confirmed that Greek sculpture was originally painted in lifelike colors. Whiteness was never the intent. It was the result of erosion and ideology. And all of this leads back to Thermopylae. The stand made there was not the last gasp of a pale European fantasy. It was the culmination of a warrior tradition forged in the Afro-Mediterranean world, sun-darkened, disciplined, and unyielding. The reason that truth had to be buried, the script argues, is simple. A black Sparta dismantles the lie that greatness was ever born white. Thermopylae itself became the stage where all of these forces, discipline, fear, geography, and myth, collided. From a military standpoint, the stand was never about winning in a conventional sense. It was about delay. Leonidas understood the terrain. The pass narrowed the battlefield to a strip of land where Persia's numbers could not be fully deployed. In that constriction, training mattered more than mass, cohesion more than scale. For 2 days, the defense held. Greek forces, anchored by Spartan discipline, absorbed repeated Persian assaults and inflicted losses that stunned an empire accustomed to overwhelming its enemies through sheer size. Shields locked, spears thrust in rhythm. The phalanx functioned as it had been designed to function, not as a loose collection of fighters, but as a single moving body. From a distance, the outcome should have been inevitable. Xerxes commanded a force that dwarfed the defenders. Ancient sources give numbers that modern historians debate, but no interpretation denies the imbalance. The Persians should have crushed the resistance quickly and moved south unimpeded. Instead, they were stalled, humiliated, and forced into repeated frontal assaults. That gained nothing. The turning point came not through strength, but betrayal. Ephialtes, a local Greek seeking reward, revealed a mountain path that bypassed the narrow pass. This route rendered the defensive line useless. Xerxes seized the opportunity immediately, sending a detachment to circle behind the Greek position under Ephialtes' guidance. Once the encirclement became clear, Leonidas convened a war council. The decision was made to dismiss the bulk of the allied Greek forces. Retreat offered survival. Staying meant certain death. Leonidas chose to remain. He stayed with his 300 Spartans, accompanied by helots and roughly 1,100 Thespians who refused to leave. This detail is often minimized or erased, but it matters. The final stand was not composed of Spartans alone. Enslaved men and allied fighters died there as well, bound by circumstance, obligation, or choice. The last phase of the battle was brief and brutal. Surrounded, outnumbered beyond calculation, the defenders fought until their spears shattered. When weapons failed, they fought with swords. When swords failed, they fought with hands, teeth, and bodies. Leonidas fell beneath a storm of Persian arrows. His body was fought over fiercely, even by the enemy, because symbolism mattered then as much as it does now. The Greeks were defeated at Thermopylae. Strategically, Persia gained passage into southern Greece. Yet the battle failed to break Greek morale. Instead, it unified resistance. The delay allowed city-states time to prepare. Within a year, Persian forces would suffer decisive defeats at Salamis and Plataea. Leonidas' legacy did not end with his death. He became a symbol of sacrifice, discipline, and defiance against overwhelming force. Soon after the battle, the Greeks erected a stone lion at Thermopylae in honor of the fallen king. Centuries later, in 1955, a statue of Leonidas was raised by King Paul of Greece to commemorate his stand and that of his soldiers. In modern times, Thermopylae has been transformed into spectacle. The battle inspired novels, paintings, and ultimately the film 300, released in 2006. And it is here that the script returns to its central question: why were these men repainted white? The answer it offers is rooted in modern history, not ancient reality. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe was building empires on slavery, colonial expansion, and rigid racial hierarchy. At the same time, Europe claimed ancient Greece as the foundation of its cultural and intellectual legitimacy. A contradiction emerged. How do you assert white supremacy when the ancient world, upon close inspection, was visibly darker? The solution was aesthetic and academic revision. Greek statues were stripped of their original pigments and presented as pure white marble. African and Afroasiatic features were softened in reproductions. Helots disappeared from military narratives. Sparta was rebranded as a proto-European ideal rather than a Mediterranean society forged through contact with Africa and the Near East. Art history played a crucial role in this transformation. Winckelmann's elevation of white marble as the pinnacle of beauty ignored extensive evidence of polychromy. Color was dismissed as corruption. Whiteness became synonymous with purity, discipline, and reason. The darker realities of antiquity were filed away as inconvenient. Yet the evidence never vanished entirely. Archaeology continued to uncover traces of pigment. Climate biology continued to contradict pale depictions. Classical texts continued to describe dark skin as ordinary. African and Near Eastern presence remained visible to anyone willing to look without modern racial assumptions. The script emphasizes that Sparta was not exceptional in this regard. It was part of a larger ancient world that included Egypt, Nubia, Phoenicia, and Persia as active participants in Mediterranean history. What made Sparta threatening to later Europe was not just its military reputation, but what it represented. A powerful society forged outside the boundaries of whiteness. Ancient authors never praised Spartans for beauty or fairness. They praised severity, endurance, and terror. Their bodies were described as forged, not adorned. Their society was described as permanently coiled for violence. Even peace was treated as preparation for war. Spartan women, too, challenged modern fantasy. They were not secluded or passive. They trained athletically, spoke openly, owned property, and managed estates. Their value to the state lay in producing strong offspring and maintaining social continuity. Domestic labor fell to helots, freeing Spartan women from many constraints imposed elsewhere in Greece. Marriage, reproduction, and family life were subordinated to state survival. Personal comfort was irrelevant. Everything served continuity of the warrior class. This rigidity reinforced a society constantly under strain, always aware of the numerical and physical power of the people it enslaved. And this returns the story to its final insistence. To imagine Sparta as uniformly white while it depended on a darkened population it feared enough to terrorize is historically incoherent. The Spartan citizen class emerged from the same sun-heavy environment, the same interconnected world, the same long exposure to Africa and the Near East. Leonidas did not die as a pale abstraction sculpted in marble centuries later. He died as a man of his world, sun-darkened, iron-bodied, and unyielding. Sparta was remembered because it embodied power. It was recolored because power frightened those who came later. That is why the truth was buried beneath marble dust and cinematic myth, because a black Sparta dismantles the lie that greatness was ever born white. What remains most unsettling about this history is not simply how Sparta has been misrepresented, but why that misrepresentation proved so necessary. The whitening of Sparta did not emerge from confusion or lack of evidence. It emerged from fear. Fear of what ancient greatness would mean if it were openly acknowledged as African and Afro-Mediterranean rather than European. Fear of what legitimacy would look like if its foundations were darker than empire wanted to admit. By the time modern Europe claimed Greece as its intellectual ancestor, racial hierarchy had already hardened into doctrine. Slavery required justification. Colonialism demanded moral cover. A white antiquity provided both. Greece became the origin story of reason, discipline, and civilization, but only after it was stripped of color, climate, and context. Sparta, with its brutal efficiency and legendary endurance, was too powerful a symbol to leave untouched. So it was remodeled, not through open declaration, but through quiet adjustment. Statues were presented without pigment. Textbooks emphasized citizen warriors while removing the helots who sustained them. Art softened features. Cinema amplified fantasy. Over time, repetition replaced evidence, and myth began to feel like memory. Yet the contradictions never fully disappeared. Climate alone refuses the illusion. Southern Greece sits under the same Mediterranean sun that darkens skin across North Africa and the Levant. Biology does not obey ideology. Neither does history. Populations exposed to generations of heat, labor, and intermixture do not emerge pale and isolated. They emerge adapted. Trade routes reinforce this reality. Sparta did not exist behind sealed borders. It traded, fought, and exchanged culture with Egypt, Phoenicia, Persia, and Anatolia. Ideas, people, and bloodlines moved constantly through the region. Ancient authors took this for granted. It is modern narratives that insist on separation. Even Spartan kingship itself undermines later racial claims. The Heraclid lineage that legitimized Spartan rule did not point north. It pointed south and east. Heracles was not imagined as a European abstraction. He was a traveler, a figure who crossed Africa, learned from African priests, and drew strength from lands outside Greece. This ancestry was political theology, not decoration. It defined authority. Sparta's obsession with control also exposes the fragility beneath its power. A society that must declare war annually on its labor force is not secure. It is terrified. The helots were not marginal figures. They were central. Their labor fed Sparta. Their bodies marched beside Spartan soldiers. Their potential rebellion haunted every policy decision. The Crypteia was not an aberration. It was an admission. It existed because Sparta understood that domination was never permanent. It had to be renewed through fear. That fear reveals the lie at the heart of sanitized Spartan imagery. This was not a harmonious brotherhood of equals. It was a rigid hierarchy enforced through violence. Acknowledging this does not diminish Spartan discipline or endurance. It contextualizes it. The warrior culture so often admired was forged under constant internal threat. Spartan unity was not natural. It was imposed. And the darker bodies erased from the story were not incidental. They were foundational. The modern retelling prefers simplicity. 300 against an empire, honor against tyranny. But simplicity requires erasure. It requires removing helots from the frame. It requires recasting Leonidas into a form that fits later expectations. It requires silence about the Afro-Mediterranean world that shaped everything from diet to skin tone to warfare. This is why Thermopylae endures as spectacle. It is easier to admire sacrifice when it is detached from context. It is easier to celebrate discipline when it is stripped of its cost. It is easier to claim inheritance when ancestors are repainted to resemble the inheritor. But history resists containment. Archaeology continues to uncover pigment. Texts continue to describe darkness as ordinary. Genetic studies continue to confirm Mediterranean and North African markers in southern Greece. Each piece alone can be dismissed. Together, they form a pattern that refuses denial. The question, then, is not whether Sparta was part of a darker ancient world. The question is why that reality remains so threatening. Because if Sparta was African and Afro-Mediterranean, then greatness does not belong to whiteness by default. If Leonidas was sun-darkened rather than marble-pale, then courage and discipline were never racially exclusive. If the foundations of Western military myth are darker than admitted, then the hierarchy built on those myths becomes unstable. That instability explains the persistence of the lie. Sparta had to be recolored because it embodied power without fitting later racial order. Its story contradicted the narrative that civilization flowed outward from a white core. It suggested instead that civilization emerged from contact, mixture, and climates that Europe later tried to distance itself from. And this is why the truth keeps resurfacing, not because of ideology, but because evidence accumulates. Because suppression leaves traces. Because erased people leave shadows. Leonidas' stand at Thermopylae was real. The discipline was real. The sacrifice was real. But the image presented centuries later was constructed. It served a different purpose than history. It served identity. To recover Sparta accurately is not to romanticize it. It is to confront it honestly. A society of extreme endurance built on extreme cruelty. A warrior elite dependent on a darker majority it feared. A culture forged in sun, scarcity, and violence, not marble halls and pale abstraction. And this honesty changes the meaning of Thermopylae itself. The stand was not the defense of a European ideal. It was the last act of a Mediterranean warrior tradition shaped by Africa, Asia, and Greece together. A tradition older than racial categories and incompatible with them. That is why the whitening of Sparta was never a small mistake. It was a structural choice. And undoing it does not rewrite history. It restores it. This is why the story cannot end quietly, because Sparta, when restored to its historical reality, does not simply challenge a visual misconception. It challenges an entire inheritance. It forces a reckoning with how power chooses its ancestors and how history is sculpted to serve the present. The Spartans were never meant to become symbols of universal virtue. They were a product of their world, brutal, disciplined, sun-hardened, and violent. Their greatness was inseparable from cruelty. Their unity depended on terror. Their endurance was purchased with blood. much of it not their own. To acknowledge this does not weaken their legacy. It makes it honest. What weakens legacy is distortion. The Whitening of Sparta was not about accuracy. It was about control. Control over narrative. Control over who gets to be remembered as the source of civilization. Control over which bodies are allowed to symbolize strength, discipline, and sacrifice. Once Sparta was recast as pale and European, it could be safely claimed. Once its African and Afro-Mediterranean roots were buried, its power could be absorbed without destabilizing the racial hierarchies of later centuries. The helots vanished. The climate was ignored. The interconnected ancient world was fragmented into modern borders that never existed. And yet, no amount of marble dust can fully erase truth, because the ancient world did not organize itself around whiteness. It organized itself around geography, climate, conquest, and exchange. Skin darkened under the sun. Cultures blended through trade and war. Lineages crossed seas. Identity was fluid long before it was frozen by modern ideology. Sparta belonged to that world. Leonidas belonged to that world. And Thermopylae belongs to that world as well. The stand at the pass was not the birth of Western exceptionalism. It was a moment within a much older human pattern. Small forces using discipline and terrain to resist overwhelming power. That pattern appears across Africa, Asia, and the ancient Mediterranean. It is not owned by one race, one continent, or one narrative. When later centuries claimed Thermopylae as proof of European destiny, they stripped it of its true context. They turned a Mediterranean event into a racial myth. They turned a complex society into a caricature. And they turned history into a mirror rather than a record. That is why this correction matters, because if Sparta was darker, then ancient greatness was never exclusive. If Spartan kings traced lineage into Afroasiatic tradition, then civilization was never racially pure. If helots formed the backbone of Spartan power, then glory was always built on exploitation. These truths disrupt comfort, and comfort, not evidence, is what most myths are designed to protect. The discomfort is the point. It forces us to ask why some histories are celebrated while others are minimized, why certain bodies are allowed to carry heroism while others are erased from the frame, why the ancient world is presented as pale when the evidence insists otherwise. Sparta did not need to be whitened to be remembered. It needed to be whitened to be claimed. And once that claim was made, it shaped everything that followed. Education, art, film, national identity. Each repetition pushed the myth further from reality, until questioning it felt radical rather than corrective. But correction is not erasure. It is restoration. Restoring Sparta to its Afro-Mediterranean context does not turn it into something else. It returns it to what it always was, a harsh society forged in heat, discipline, and fear, connected to Africa and the Near East through ancestry, climate, and culture. A society whose power frightened later empires enough to repaint it. That fear tells us everything. Because power is always nervous about precedent. If ancient greatness was darker, then modern hierarchies lose their historical justification. If civilization did not originate in whiteness, then whiteness loses its claim to inevitability. That is why the truth had to be buried. But buried does not mean gone. It survives in fragments of pigment, in uncomfortable texts, in climate science, in suppressed letters, in the quiet contradictions that refuse to resolve no matter how often the myth is repeated. Sparta was remembered because it embodied power. It was recolored because power feared what that memory would mean if left intact. Leonidas did not die for a future racial fantasy. He died within the logic of his own world, a world far more complex, darker, and interconnected than later centuries wanted to admit. And once you see that, Thermopylae changes forever. It is no longer a story about Europe standing alone against the East. It is a story about the ancient Mediterranean resisting empire, about disciplined bodies shaped by sun and scarcity, about a warrior tradition that cannot be contained by modern categories. That is the truth beneath the myth, and that truth does not weaken history. It exposes it.